Hey everybody. Greetings on this rare gray and gloomy day down here in Florida, hence the lamps that we've got on in the background. And welcome to the first of our 3 video lectures on intercultural communication. In this video lecture, we'll focus on international communication. And the first thing that you need to know about communicating across national or regional cultural contexts is this. To successfully focus on your reader's needs, to fulfill that most basic principle of business and workplace communication, you must target your message to your reader's cultural context. In other words, it's not enough to write a message that speaks to your audience's business or professional needs. You must also produce a message that is tailored to the communications preferences of their cultural context. And doing so is incredibly important. Successfully adapting to cultural context is a key to professional success, and it's a key to your success as a communicator. And effectively communicating in an international context is only going to become more important as the business and professional community becomes increasingly international in character. Now, to help you achieve this, to help you become an effective and successful international communicator, I've developed some simple but flexible tips that you can use throughout your careers. And the first tip is this: be self-aware. Many of your behaviors and your attitudes are in fact culturally specific. In this class, for instance, I've instructed you to take a direct approach to business and workplace communication. That instruction, that style of communication, is itself culturally specific. It is specific to a U.S. business and workplace communication context. And while it's quite effective in that context, in other parts of the world, it might be perceived as rude or pushy. And to be a successful communicator, you have to be aware of those potential differences, along with many, many, many others. Tip 2. Be modest. Don't assume that your way of doing things is the best way or the only way. In other words, it's not enough to simply be aware that other parts of the world have different ways of doing things. You must also be sensitive to the virtue and the value of other ways of doing things. Yes, a direct style of communication is very good at communicating quickly and efficiently, but it's not particularly good at relationship building. And so a more indirect style of communication that's favored by other cultures and other parts of the world might be optimized for inspiring a sense of shared culture, shared purpose in a way that a direct approach simply cannot achieve. Tip 3. Be observant, do your research, and if appropriate, ask questions. If you know that you're going to be interacting with folks from other parts of the world, do some research. Learn about your audience's communication and cultural preferences. Then, when you're actually in the context where you're interacting with those folks from other parts of the world, be observant. Take careful note of what kinds of communications approaches produce positive outcomes and which ones produce less positive outcomes. And lastly, if you have a question about something that you can't easily look up, ask. It's always better to admit your ignorance and ask a question than to go on offending people. And finally, our last rule, remember we live in a mobile world. Just because you encounter somebody in one part of the world doesn't mean that they're from that part of the world. If you're going on a business trip to France, for instance, you'll likely encounter folks from many other parts of the world. And those folks may or may not be entertained or impressed by your thorough mastery of French business culture. So yes, do your research, but also be observant and be flexible. Now, to help prepare you for the kinds of research that you need to do to be effective international communicators, I want to introduce you to two models of cultural difference associated with the scholars Hofstede and Victor. Let's take a look at Victor's model first. Now, according to Professor David A. Victor, differences in culture tend to cluster around the following 7 areas. First area is language, right? What language do people speak in a given culture or society? It's an obvious difference, but it's nevertheless a very important one. The second difference is environment. Does a society or culture correspond to a hot part of the world or a cool part of the world? A rainy part of the world or a dry part of the world, for instance? The third point is social organization. Does a society or culture tend to have a very individualistic, acquisitive social organization, for instance, or does it tend to have a more collectivist, mutualistic social organization? Fourth point is context. Do you need a ton of context to understand what somebody's saying in a given society or culture, or do people tend to communicate very directly? Next point is authority. Does a society or culture tend to be very hierarchical, or does it tend to be more non-hierarchical? Next point is nonverbal communication. Is meaning communicated primarily non-verbally in a given society or cultural context, or is it articulated very specifically in words and language? And then the last point is time orientation. How tolerant is a given society or culture for lateness versus punctuality? On the other hand, we have a model associated with Professor Geert Hofstede. And according to Hofstede, differences in culture tend to cluster around the following 6 areas. The first of these is power difference. Are people in positions of power or authority viewed as these kind of aloof, monarchical, semi-divine figures, or are they seen as just kind of normal, everyday people? The next point is individualism versus collectivism. Do people take identity from their individual position in society, or do they tend to derive meaning and identity based on their membership in larger collectives? Third point is masculinity versus femininity, or tough versus tender. Is a given society or culture characterized, does it value stereotypically masculine traits like aggressiveness or toughness, or does a given society or culture tend to value more stereotypically feminine traits like tenderness or care? The next point is uncertainty avoidance. How tolerant is a given society or culture for uncertainty or risk? Next point is long-term versus short-term orientation. Does a given society or culture tend to think about the consequences of actions primarily in terms of their long-term impact or their short-term impact? And lastly, we have indulgence versus restraint. Does a given society or culture expect folks to restrain themselves, restrain their impulses, or is that society or culture open to the open expression of whatever impulses might come into a person's head? Now, to be clear, these models of cultural difference, they don't provide you with with actionable, concrete information about how to interact with people from different parts of the world, right? They don't tell you how to communicate successfully with folks from South Korea versus South Africa versus Uruguay. But they do tell you where cultural differences tend to cluster. And they therefore can help make you not only a more targeted and focused researcher, but they can also make you a more targeted and focused observer. And that's really the point. There's no video lecture, and certainly not this one, that could tell you everything that you need to know about how to effectively communicate with folks from all over the world. Instead, you can only prepare yourself to be a good researcher and be a good observer so that you have the flexibility and the agility to respond to the wide variety of situations that your careers and your life are likely to present. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of this, our first video lecture on intercultural communication. Please stay tuned for our following 2 video lectures on related topics. And as always, thanks for watching.